Hey folks, here we are, video number 19 in the Catholic theological tradition. We've already talked about Augustine. We did an introduction in the last video. Here we're going to look at Augustine's theology in one particular area. We're going to talk about his theology of the church and the contributions he made towards the theology of the church and the theology of the sacraments. And really, interestingly enough, the church and the sacraments are really cut from the same cloth. If you think about the creed, whether you think about the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, I know we didn't have time to go over the creed in detail because we're doing a historical overview, but I want you to think there's only 3 stanzas to the classic Christian creeds. And in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, the church falls under the 3rd stanza. It's a work of the Spirit. And the sacraments are mentioned, insofar as they're mentioned in the creed, they're mentioned in that 3rd stanza, a work of the Spirit, a work of the church in the Holy Spirit, the Spirit working through the church. So sacraments and church are part of the same stanza of the creed. There's a real intrinsic connection between them. I want to talk about a problem that we've bumped into a little bit so far. It goes way back to Tertullian's time. We saw it with Arius. There is a problem with who should be allowed to go to communion. Right now, there's a problem in our day and age regarding this, and on the issue of divorce, remarriage, etc., and who's allowed to communion. It's a pretty hot topic, pretty hot debate. Well, it was a hot debate back then. Who should be allowed to go to communion? Who can be forgiven? What must they do to be forgiven? We're not going to let those people in. Our family members, and many of us, suffered imprisonment and torture. Those people wimped out or they compromised in some way, and you're going to let them come back to communion? I'm not going to go for that. You know, so there was tremendous amount of controversy that kept erupting in various places about this issue, about the bishops being too soft. About the bishops hedging and compromising. And the place where this was most intense was North Africa. Most other schisms or most other rigorisms, you know, they came and went, but North Africa just would not go away. There were very hardline sorts of people who just kept pointing the finger at folks and saying that's compromise and that's wrong. The Donatists were a North African group that objected to the consecration after the end of the Great Persecution. Remember, Constantine becomes emperor in the year 312. You must remember 313. 313 is a famous pivotal date, and that's the date when there's a decree of religious liberty. So it's the end of persecution for all intents and purposes, at least in the West. There was unfortunately a little that lingered on for a few more years in the East. But in North Africa, it was over in 313, okay? So there is a bishop consecrated, and there's a number of North Africans who say, I don't accept that bishop, because one of the co-consecrators who laid hands on that bishop is someone who, during the persecution, obeyed the Romans and handed over the sacred books. They're traitors. The word traitor comes from traditor, or someone who hands over. A traitor can hand over a colleague to the authorities, or some of the traitors handed over sacred vessels or sacred books to the Romans. They didn't deny Christ. Some of them didn't even hand over real books that were scriptures. The Roman police only understood Latin. They gave them Greek medical books, and it was a ruse. It was a trick. But these hardliners said, that's not clever, that's dishonest, that's cowardice. If someone did that, they lose their orders. They can't communicate holiness by episcopal consecration or confirmation or baptism. All they can communicate is their own stain of sin. So there's a sacramental theology that's part of this Donatism. There's 2 issues. Number 1, the church is holy, and therefore we are the true church. They had some rigorous bishops from Numidia ordain them a new bishop of Carthage that was to their liking. So it begins a schism, the Catholics and the Donatists. And there are parallel hierarchies set up in all the towns of North Africa. And guess what? The majority are not the Catholics. In North Africa, the majority are the Donatists. St. Augustine is a Catholic bishop, and he's dealing with this schism. And in Hippo, his diocese, his faithful Catholics in that diocese are estimated by one scholar, one of the experts on Augustine, to number no more than 800 in the diocese, Catholics. The rest are Donatists. So that's pretty shocking, I would say, wouldn't you think? So this is a big problem. And so it's ecclesiological. The key idea is the church is holy, and therefore we're the true church, not you. You say you're Catholics, but you're not Catholics because you are harboring evil people and evil officers in your midst. Your sacraments are invalid, and you're not the true church because the true church is holy. So it's a holier-than-thou church. Augustine ridicules them, saying, they're like frogs croaking, "We're the only Christians, we're the only Christians." This kind of elitism is usually a sign of heresy and of schism. It's a bad sign, this kind of rigorism, okay? So a sinful cleric can only communicate infection, not holiness. His orders are invalidated. And therefore, the sacraments depend upon the moral purity of the clergy. That's the idea of Donatism. Okay, Augustine's response is very important for our sacramental theology and our theology of the church now. Because Augustine says that the true church, the church Catholic, is the church universal. The Donatists have been condemned. They are condemned by the emperor. They're condemned by the Pope of Rome. No one else outside of North Africa recognizes the Donatists. They are a local North African sect. So they can't be the true church because the true church is Catholic or universal. So that's the first point that he makes, the Catholicity and universality of the church against sects or little fringe splinter groups. The next thing he says is that it's impossible. We're in an impossible situation if the validity of our sacraments and our salvation depends on the unknowable moral purity of the clergy. Because the clergy may have been validly consecrated, but various clergy may get into mortal sin, and we don't know about it. And therefore, does that mean, that's an impossible. God could never have willed that. He never could have set a system up like that. It's an impossible system. He cares too much about us. He loves us. And it's not the priest who makes the sacraments happen. It's Christ. So there's a famous phrase, and you need to know this phrase because it comes up in theology, ex opere operato. So what does it mean? It means pretty much this, literally, I'm going to tell you, it means it's from the work being performed itself on the merit of the work or the act itself, not on the merit or the basis of the actor, the president, okay? Fundamentally, what this simply means is it's Christ who makes the sacraments happen. Whenever anyone's baptized, it's Christ who does the baptizing. He's just using the person baptizing, whether it be a deacon or a priest or a bishop or a lay person. Because, in baptism, we believe a lay person can administer that sacrament. So whoever confers a sacrament, he's just an instrument. So it takes an ordained priest to preside over the Eucharist. It takes a bishop to consecrate and ordain priests and bishops, yes. But it's Christ acting through the bishop, Christ acting through the priest. It's not based on the purity of the priest or the bishop. It's based on the power of Jesus Christ. That's a very, very important sacramental principle. That's been implicit, really, in the tradition, but it had to be made explicit and clear now because of the Donatist challenge. How does doctrine develop? Usually, it's forced to develop and grow and become more explicit and clearer because of heresy. So that's the way the Donatists impact the development of ecclesiology in Augustine and the development of sacramental theology. Okay, so as far as Augustine's concerned, this is why in the Catholic Church we accept the validity of the baptism of those who are schismatics and even to some degree who are heretics and wrong on doctrine. As long as baptism is performed in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and it's performed with water, we believe that the Lord shows up. Jesus shows up. Jesus does the baptizing, whether it be a Protestant minister baptizing by a river, whether it be a Donatist. So the Catholic Church, beginning with Augustine there, is, well, I would say this actually predates Augustine, but Augustine accepted the baptism of the Donatists. And the Donatists, there was no question, they had valid orders. So Augustine and the early church accepted the sacraments of the Donatists. But the Donatists would not accept the sacraments of the Catholics. This is an important thing to understand. Now, one of the sad things about all this is that the Donatists were violent. There were Donatist gangs of thugs that would vandalize Catholic churches. And so Augustine called on the secular arm of the government to protect the churches and to punish those who destroyed the churches. Now, here's the problem. Augustine was not calling on the government to compel orthodoxy. He was calling on the government here, in all fairness to him, to protect the property and the lives of Catholics. However, after this, more and more, increasingly, the government starts compelling orthodoxy, starts compelling Christian faith in the case of Jews, etc., etc. And people point back to Augustine as authorization for this. It's an illegitimate use of Augustine's authority. But the Donatist crisis is not changed by Augustine's great theology. It helps us today. It helps the church ever since the time of Augustine to understand the sacraments better, understand the church better. But unfortunately, the schism endures. And that schism in the western part of North Africa weakens the church, just like the Monophysite schism in the eastern part of North Africa, Libya and Egypt, weakened the church. So when the Muslim invaders come in the 7th century, they find a divided church all the way from the beginning to the east to the west of North Africa. The church is weak and divided it is easily conquered. So to this day, the auxiliary bishops in the United States are often, you have to be technically a bishop of somewhere. So if you're not the Bishop of Dallas and you're being consecrated to be an auxiliary bishop, you got to be made the bishop of somewhere. And guess where the bishop's sees are? They're defunct sees, mostly in North Africa. I remember growing up, the auxiliary bishop of Providence, Rhode Island, my hometown, was the bishop of Setamonicia, a Roman town in North Africa that now has no Christians in it, only has a mosque. But that's what Christian disunity does. And so if we're worried about the expansion of secularism in the West or the expansion of Islam taking over Christian countries, we need to look to ourselves. If we're united and we're strong and we're living our faith in a vital way, we don't have to worry about invasion. We don't have to worry about conversion.
Thank you.